Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Lighthouse podcast. My name is Alex Camargo, and I'm here with a really good friend today, a real estate attorney, somebody who's been in this business for a long time and is an important member of our community, Attorney Larry Pereira. You don't want to miss this. We're going to talk about many things that are happening in our current market right now. As always, if you could do us a favor, like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and help us share this content with other people who may be looking into buying or selling real estate, but more importantly, who want to learn more about important members of our community. Stay tuned. My friend, Mr. Larry Pereira. Alex. What an honor it is to have you on our podcast. You've been a friend for a long time. You've been a mentor in many of these transactions. I don't know if you knew this, but the first ever transaction in real estate that I had as an agent, you were the attorney on the other on our side, and you've always been an open book about the business, and you're always willing to teach it, not only to our clients. And of course, even when we come in for a closing with our clients and throughout the transaction, I learn a lot from you, right? Like I said, it's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you sharing your knowledge and content and experience with our clients. Welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I think it's a good start of this conversation if we could, if I can get your perspective on what has happened with real estate over the last 3 years since COVID.
Since COVID, actually, when COVID hit, it was already crazy. Yeah. I don't know if you remember. Yeah. So things were gangbusters. And I remember when COVID hit, I said to my wife, oh boy, this is going to be horrible for us. You know, people were talking about lockdowns, and then out of the blue, we get the governor's order that we're deemed essential and that real estate's essential. And we worked the whole way through COVID. And I'm still, overwhelmed by the way the markets continue to press forward. You know, and I kept saying, and I actually probably was one of the people that was saying back in 2020, that's it, this is the peak, you know, we're this is going to drop off, and we've continued to push. With the rates the way they are, with the way the prices are, I'm still surprised people are buying. I guess it's a function of there's not a lot of inventory and people are desperate, rentals are expensive, but it's been off the wall crazy. Let's put it that way, I guess, for lack of a better way of explaining it.
Yeah. And I as an agent, right, on my good years, I have 30, 40 transactions. But as an attorney, there's 1.5 million registered agents with the Realtor Association as it stands. But there's only a handful of real estate attorneys in each town, right? So you get to see way more transactions than I do, probably 10, 15 times the amount of transactions. So you get to learn a lot in that process as well. What has that been like? Like, for instance, how many transactions did you close last year, more or less?
Probably about 300 to 400 transactions.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And, you were talking about, how many transactions we handle. I remember being a young attorney and being one of the Bar Association meetings. And I don't know if you remember Hugh Burrell. Yeah. He used to be an old-time real estate attorney, and Hugh was a top producer in real estate. And he used to say he equates himself to a air traffic controller, and he's got all these files up in the air, and what he's doing is just trying to keep them afloat. We've got mortgage contingencies that we have to deal with. We have closing dates. We have expectations of clients that when they sign a contract and says this is the closing date, that's the date they're going to move into the new home. And it doesn't always happen, as you know. There's delays in financing. There's delays in inspections. There's delays in all sorts of things. I've actually had I used to tell people, don't make any plans, because you never know. The moving truck could break down. And sure enough, I had a transaction where the moving truck broke down. I think it didn't break down. I think the poor men got into an accident and couldn't help the woman move that day, so we had to postpone the closing. But there's a lot of moving parts, dealing with sometimes, 80 to 100 files at a clip. It's daunting. It's definitely a ton of transaction, especially in your position, right? As being the attorney, as being one of the parties responsible for meeting all these deadlines, right? And then if we can't meet a deadline for whatever reason, if we can't meet a mortgage contingency, then ultimately
you're still responsible for asking for extensions and ensuring that the client or the buyer or the seller are well protected. Like it's a ton of work.
Yeah. I equate myself to the anchor man on a 4x4 relay. You watch the Olympics, get the 4x4, the passing you the baton. And I always tell my clients this, I'm the last guy that takes you across the finish line. Sometimes I got a bit of a lead. Normally I'm behind and I have to do some catching up to get you that finish line. So and of course everything sort of snowballs, you start with the agents and looking for the home and putting in the offers, and it gets, passed over to the mortgage broker, and then eventually ends up in our hands. And sometimes, more often than not, we're trying to play catch up.
Yeah. And in this market, right, which has been crazy for the last 4 or 5 years, but more specifically for, in the last 3 years, and in our case, in our local market, with so many people coming from out of state, have you found that people's nerves and personalities have been rattled?
Absolutely. I find that people are more on edge. There is, with technology, internet, computers, people are expecting, and I call it the Amazon effect, right? So, you put in an offer on a house and you want to be able to track, and you expect it's going to be at your doorstep within a certain period of time. And with real estate, you don't know. You assume, all right, we've got our dates and this is what we're shooting for. And sometimes the mortgage brokers get thrown a curveball. Sometimes, the appraisers get thrown a curveball. And sometimes we do with title issues. But yeah, I have noticed that people are a little less accepting of, disappointment. I don't know if there's a better way of explaining it, but people are hard to please and expect a lot more.
Yeah.
And again, nothing against the New Yorkers, but they're a little more expectant. They're a little more, I guess, savvy, and maybe things are faster paced in New York than they are in Connecticut. So they're moving at another level.
Yeah.
And when they come to Connecticut, we're sort of a little bit slower than they expect, and it's made some challenges for us.
Yeah, I remember 5-6 years ago, if you ever mentioned closing a property in 21 days, like everybody would be rattled by that. Yeah. And now we have that expectation that, if everything goes well and somebody's buying a property cash, okay, we can close it in 21 days. Just because we can doesn't really mean that we should attempt to do it, just because if anything goes wrong, now you're affecting people's expectation that you could. And in our industry, I think more can go wrong than right.
Oh, absolutely,
right? So,
absolutely. When we're rushing, that's when we're apt to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And we've closed some deals in less than 21 days. People are waiving inspection contingencies. People are waiving all sorts of inspections. And I think we're going to have a huge real estate litigation boom. I think a lot of people are going to realize that they made a big mistake in waiving inspections, moving forward, and moving too fast.
Yeah.
I try to tell people, you're not buying a T-shirt. You're buying a house. It's one of the biggest transactions you're going to make during your lifetime. And you want to make sure you do it right. And sometimes we have to slow things down a little bit.
Yeah. Have you found, have you heard of, through your clients, and I could probably answer this on my end, but you've been through more transactions. Have you found some of your clients to already have buyer's remorse?
No, I think I've had some people walk away from deals at the very end. I just had a woman actually closed her yesterday, and she came in, she was smiling ear to ear, and all I can think of is, maybe 2-3 months back, she was in my office wanting to get out of a deal. She had done an inspection on the well. There was, I think it was uranium or something was found in the well, and she didn't want to buy that house. She was feared for her health and her family's health, and fast forward to this closing, she was ecstatic, and I asked her, I said, you happy? And she's like, yeah, better than the last. She's like, yes, absolutely. And I said, look, God works in mysterious ways. Yeah. And on your previous podcast, you were talking about how people are disappointed, and I always tell people, listen, there's something better out there for you. You may have lost this opportunity, but there's another better one waiting for you. Yeah. Yeah. And for the most part, I've been right. I think everything happens for a reason, and this house wasn't for her. And she was adamant she didn't want it. We got her out of the deal. Cost her a little bit because we already passed all our contingencies. We were almost ready to close. We were actually at the point, I called her to schedule, and she says, we have a problem. I guess the water test must have come in late. But fast forward to Friday, we closed her dream home.
Yeah. That's awesome. And it's coincidental that you say that, because I just closed a deal a few weeks back where our first offer was accepted. 2 days later, they get out of our offer using the 5-day attorney contingency, which It is what it is, right? So we put a few more offers. We got those rejected, and we weren't getting anything. And then the house that my clients finally closed on is so much better than any other ones, any other of the other ones that we put offers on. And the conversation is always the same. There's something better out there.
Something better,
and everything happens for a reason, right? And especially for my clients of faith and the believe in God, and you have to continue to have that faith, right? That that it's the right house for me will come along, right? Because there are plenty of homes out there, right? But which one is the right house for you?
At that moment,
it's
hard. At that moment when they're losing their what they thought was their dream home, there's nothing you can say, but you just hope that fast forward, a month later, 2 months later, they can look back and say, yeah, you were right. And for the most part, it's happened out that way.
Yeah. You've been doing this for a long time, right? How without having to date yourself. Let's pretend you started, you went to college at 16.
20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. And it's been 20 years of working, of serving many different demographics in our community, right? So you're Portuguese descent, so you speak Portuguese and you serve the Portuguese and the Brazilian in their own language, and you serve the Hispanics and the Latinos in their own language as well. And of course, every other English-speaking client. How has that helped you become a better attorney by being able to serve people in different languages?
And I'm going to steal this actually from the speech that Miguel Cardonas, our Secretary of Education, made last night. So he was talking about being multilingual as being a superpower, right? So we're able to communicate in different languages. And, my wife talks about code switching, and of course he brought that up last night, so she's a proud peacock knowing what he's talking about. But our experiences with different cultures allows us to communicate with different folks. When I'm sitting down with Ecuadorians or Dominicans or Brazilians or, everybody else, you sort of are able to relate and communicate in their own languages, which is important. And I've had situations where people ask me, do you speak Spanish? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And I start speaking in Spanish, and they're responding to me in perfect English. I'm like, why did you ask me? You speak perfect English, but they're like, oh, we feel more comfortable knowing that you know how to speak our language. And I always joke with my clients, I ask them, do you understand what I'm saying? Because I'm Portuguese descent. I do speak Spanish, and a lot of my clients are Spanish descent. So I joke with them that it's a little bit of Spanglish, Spanish, Portuguese, English mixed in. And I'll tell you, the biggest and best compliment I got, it was that I was doing a closing in Spanish, and I could see that this woman's face was, she had this perplexed look, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's not understanding me. So I said, do you understand what I'm telling you? And she goes, yeah. She goes, I'm just dumbfounded because I've done so many of these before, and this is the first time I'm understanding everything I'm signing. I'm like, well, I'm doing my job. Yeah. And I never assume, even if I have people that come in that have done closings before, I never assume that they know what they're signing or what's being put before them, so I'll explain things to them. And I've had people say, you know what, this is the first time I know what I've signed, and you explain everything very well.
Yeah, and it's one of the many things that I appreciate about you. I tend to be the educator when it comes to my clients, right? I can sell you a home, I can type a contract, I can put an offer, but I consider myself to be a home buying coach for my clients because I want them to know what a furnace is or what a boiler is when we enter a house, right? I want them to have that knowledge. And a lot of people, you throw furnace and boiler out there and they don't know which one is which, right? So as I'm showing homes, when I first take on a client, I'll do a buyer presentation. Of course, it's free of cost to them, right? And it's usually about an hour. And I tell them, look, I have 10 hours worth of information to give you. Of course, I can't give you everything all at once. It's going to be overwhelming. So we're going to talk for about an hour. We're going to get you ready to start this process. And every time I go show you a home or every call that we do, I'm going to try to teach you a little bit more about the purchase that you're making or the whole process, right? And then the expectation that I have for the people that I work with and recommend, other professionals, right? The mortgage agent, the attorney, the insurance agent, is that they follow along the same lines. Because my goal at the end of the day, especially when we're dealing with the first-time buyer clientele, they've never bought a home before. They don't know what any of this is like, right? So my goal is let's educate this client in a way that he knows every step of the way what he's doing, right? Not just throw a form in there and say, sign it. No, this is what you're signing, right? And then when we get to the attorney's table for a closing, just going through all the paperwork. And I'll say this publicly, I'm very appreciative of how you handle a closing, because you not only care for what they're doing, you not only care for what they're signing, so you care to explain it and to educate them, but you, being a person of such a good heart, you care for their emotional, right? So many times Absolutely. You stop the transaction and you're like, is this working out for you? Like, are you aware of what you're doing? Are you sure of what you're doing? Type of thing, because you care for their well-being, right? It's what we say in real estate. Real estate is relational and not transactional. And you could be an attorney closing 300 and 400 closings a year. It's very easy for you to, if you wanted to let that be transactional, but you make it very personable every step of the way. So
it's a relationship. It's a relationship, and I do have a lot of bad jokes that go along with how I explain things to people. And do I read every single document to them verbatim? No, but I give them a synopsis of what they're signing, what to expect, what I would want to be told. Yeah. If there's a prepayment penalty, if the rate's fixed, what their monthly payment is. Sometimes I'll go above and beyond, and the lenders probably don't like this, but I try to explain to them, look, if you put a little extra principal, here's how much it'll save you. And I'll run a little amortization schedule for them. So I tend to take a professorial approach to my clients. Yep. And in the olden days, I remember going to closings, and I was a seller's attorney, and I show up, and I know that they had started 15 minutes ago, and they're already signed. And how's that possible? Yeah. So you would have attorneys, and you talked about real estate attorneys. We only have a handful of them that are pretty much, real estate attorneys. And then you have attorneys that do real estate as part of their business. And those are the ones that'll sit in there and just have you sign your life away and not tell you what you're signing. Yeah. And especially with a lot of our folks, they don't read English. Yeah. So they need somebody to explain it to them. And this goes back to when I was a little kid. My grandmother only spoke Portuguese. So I grew up and was raised with her. My parents had the grocery store, so I was always the one that would take her to, I remember walking downtown to pay the gas bill. We'd go to Dunkin' Donuts when it was, great donuts back then. Now they've sort of made it much smaller, or maybe I'm bigger, who knows. But I remember being her translator, going to the bank with her, and I sort of, go back to those days.
You've been an attorney since you were 7.
Yeah, exactly. I guess if you want to say that, yes. Yes. We are some of all of our life's experiences, right? Yeah. So, a lot of the things that I've done in the past have sort of brought me to where I am today.
Yeah, and that's awesome. Where do you think we're headed in real estate? Right. So, refi boom at some point. Sometime, hopefully soon.
That's conventional wisdom, yes. Yeah. And again, if I'm probably the worst person to ask about this, because I had said back in 2000 this thing's going to bust, and then of course no one could have anticipated the pandemic was going to take us in the direction it did. But I was worried back then. People were buying homes or coming off the market quicker than you putting them on, and then the pandemic, if it was possible, accentuated what was already a crazy market. Yeah. So I think it's gonna hit a peak. And maybe now the craziness, because we were talking about how the stress and handling all these files, and the conventional saying now is that every deal's an ordeal, right? So a lot of people are rolling up their sleeves, fighting over the littlest things. I had one yesterday. They were ready to blow up the deal over blinds, which are $35 ticket items that you can go to Home Depot and buy. But still, it was just the one client expected it would be there, the other client didn't know he couldn't take it, and we were fighting over that. I've had people take washers and dryers, So I think we're at the peak. They're talking about rates coming down. If they do come down, I think you're going to see, for us, it's going to be a great, boom in terms of refinancing. Yeah. I've actually worked through some of my clients and showing them alternatives to refinancing, maybe putting a little extra towards principal, but depending on where the rates go, it's going to make a ton of sense for people to refinance. I think we got spoiled. 3% interest rates. Yeah. I don't know that we'll ever see 3% again. But.
Yeah, you're right. And I think a 4 to 5% rate is ideal for real estate, right? Yeah. 3% is like you mentioned, probably will never happen again unless something drastic
never know.
Happens. But I think a 7 or 8%, and when I say this, the folks who had 18% 30 years ago will probably look at me weird, but in today's market, I think a 7 or 8% may not be sustainable for a long time, right? So I think a 4 and 5%, if it eventually can come down to that, is a good point. And what I'm telling my clients often is, look, if you're getting a 7.25% now, if it dips below 6, refinance. And then if it dips again, refinance again. You know, when you run the numbers, it makes sense, you know,
exactly.
because it may dip below 6.
If they're going to stay there long term.
Yeah. If it dips below 6 and then, you know, it goes back to 7 or 8, then you'll be glad that you refinance at that point. And we continue to tell clients, look, if you can still afford to buy a house with a 7% or 7.25%, 7.5%, buy it, because once rates drop, now you have 30, 40, 50% more buyers in the buyer pool being able to afford the same house. So that's going to, you know, shoot those prices up again.
I think where we're a little better positioned than we were in 2005 is that you don't see the the adjustable rate mortgages. There's no prepayment penalties. And you're right, people, as long as they can afford these mortgage payments, they'll be okay.
Yeah.
You know, but you see some of these mortgage payments and they're daunting.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, we are downtown Danbury, we're right next to ARC, and I see, you know, people are starting to suffer. People are starting to not be able to pay all their bills. You know, you hear grumblings about people falling behind in their credit card debt. You know, we have the food pantry next door, and the line seems to be getting longer and longer. So I know these are all signs that things starting to slow down.
Yeah.
As long as the job market keeps going, we'll be okay. I think if the job market starts dropping off, I think that's where we're going to see some issues.
Yeah. Now, as an attorney, you're a real estate attorney, are there any other services that you offer to our community?
Yeah, we're basically a transactional firm. We do wills, leasing. We set up corporations and LLCs for people. Anything transactional. We don't do any litigation. My partner, Fred, does tax work, so he represents people before the IRS, DRS, trying to negotiate that debt. We also do probate, so unfortunately, if you have a family member that's passed away, we can handle the probating those assets.
Yeah, that's it's nice that you touched on one of the services that you offer, which is also, it's always a conversation that I have with my clients as soon as they buy their first asset, real estate asset, which I consider that to be a major stepping stone in purchasing more, but also being mindful that they protect what they have, right? So every time we're closing a transaction, I tell them, go back to your attorney or go back to this or that attorney and set up a will.
Yep.
You know, or if you're in a different position in life, you know, do you need a trust? You know, in the same way I talk about insurance, right? So you buy your first real estate purchase, be mindful of not carrying minimum state insurance, which may only cover $40,000 or $50,000, and most cars on the road right now are worth way more than that, right?
Something I never thought of. That's good advice.
So, I tell people to come back to you all the time for wills and trusts.
Wish they would listen to you.
Could you talk to us a little bit about those two and why they're important?
Yeah. So the advantage of having a will. We see this on real estate transactions. I can't tell you how many times we've had situations where we're buying from an estate, and the first question I ask the attorney for the seller, is there a will with the power to sell? Where are you with the process? Well, if there's no will, you got to go into court and you got to get a court approval, which means you got to wait for a date to meet with the judge. They're doing most things remotely now. And then there's a 30-day appeal period, and depending on who the interested parties in the probate matter are, you may not be able to close till after those 30 days are up. With a will, you can specify, all right, I'm giving my executor, you get to pick the person you want, so not the judge, you know, so you can say, hey, I trust this person to be my executor. And what the executor is really the person that's going to carry out your wishes. They're going to bring the document to the judge, and then they're going to be charged with the task of making sure that your wishes get followed. And they'll have certain powers. So if they need to sell real estate, they can go ahead and sell real estate. Also in the will, we normally put in there that you can waive the bond. So if you don't have a will, the judge could impose a bond requirement, which means now you have to buy insurance for the estate, and it can cost you up to $1,500 depending on the person's credit and things of that nature. So the will helps move those things along. Where I think, you know, eventually if you don't have a will, your assets will make it to the people you love, but it won't be as quick and maybe not the way you want it to be. Under the laws of intestacy, if you don't have a will, the first 150 goes to the spouse, and then the rest of it's divided 50-50 between the kid and the spouse. And you never know if that's going to be the best solution. So normal will, you pass away, you leave everything to your spouse. If your spouse predeceases you, it goes to your kids in equal shares. Talking about kids, if they're minors, you want to establish and set up a guardianship for them. So if something happens to the two of you, you want to make sure that there's somebody that you trust, not who the judge thinks is appropriate to take care of your kids. You could also set up a trusteeship for their property until they get to a certain age. So there's a lot of huge benefits of having a will, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. When I think of a simple will, it provides for the kids to have a trust until a certain age. It provides for guardianship. You'll see some of these attorneys that try to push people on trusts and try to convince them that it'll avoid probate, and it really doesn't. There's a lot of sharks out there. I've had elderly clients come to me with a trust that was all set up. They spent $3,000 or $4,000. I'm like, all right, what's in the trust? It was never funded. The property was never transferred into it. None of the assets were, so it was an empty trust. So they spent all this money for nothing. So you got to be careful, and who you talk to and what they try to sell you on.
Yeah, that's awesome. So purchase a house, talk to your attorney about a will. Probably one of the first things that you should be doing. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, my friend, I thank you so much for coming here and sharing all this knowledge with us. Always appreciative of you as an attorney, of you as a friend, as a mentor, a guide, not only to myself, but to all the clients that I help that end up coming to you as well. Looking forward to more transactions and looking forward to continuing to have this friendship with you. Thank you, Larry.
Thanks, buddy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.